Well, my father was a combat sergeant in World War II. And when I was little, I knew that, but I didn't know anything about it. When I was young, he would kind of fire out stories, kind of like machine gun fire, and he'd abruptly stop, but they were scary things. And I felt this wound that he carried, and he would not talk about it. My dad wouldn't talk about the past ever, not 5 years ago, not 5 minutes ago. He was always moving forward. He didn't want to ruin the day by talking about anything in the past. And when he was 89, he came to visit me in Portland. And my father had fathered 8 children and married 4 times. And there was a lot of trauma in my childhood that was secondary trauma from his PTSD, really, and things that, happened because he was stuck in post-traumatic stress. And so there was a lot to clear up, but I wanted to hear about the war. And we went back and forth and back and forth. And this is like the most difficult conversation I've ever had that it really changed my life.
Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lucy, and we love having difficult conversations.
That's right. And each week we'll either share a tip, hear how others have gotten better at difficult conversations, or demonstrate common difficult conversations and what to do and what not to do.
Let's get into it.
Welcome to another episode of the Art and Science of Difficult Conversations. My name is Lucy, and I'm your host today. And I have an amazing guest with me today, Becky Ellis. And I am so curious and excited for our conversation because it seems like from the brief exchange that we had before our live show, seems like we share a lot of similar experiences. Both of us, our ancestors, our family members were fighting in the Second World War, even though on the opposite sides. But both of our families were actually impacted. And there are lots of stories and even difficult conversations about those. And so I'm super excited. Welcome to our show. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to give you a word to introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I'm thrilled to be here and to have this conversation, especially because we do share a common history. And it's something that's really difficult to talk about usually. So I appreciate being here and having that opportunity. I am Becky Ellis, as you said, and I am a writer and writing teacher, and I live in Portland, Oregon. And my new debut memoir came out in March. It's called Little Avalanches. And that's why I'm here to talk about the tough stuff. Yeah.
Yay! So not yay to tough stuff, but yay to sharing, having the courage, because it also takes courage to share the tough stuff, especially personal stories from our families. That is very courageous because it's also vulnerable. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we have another thing in common. I also used to be a teacher.
Yay.
For high school. So, but now back to you and your memoir. What would you say inspired you to write that rather than just keeping it to yourself or your family's history? What inspired you to share with the public?
Well, my father was a combat sergeant in World War II. And when I was little, I knew that, but I didn't know anything about it. When I was young, he would kind of fire out stories, kind of like machine gun fire, and he'd abruptly stop, but they were scary things. And I felt this wound that he carried, and he would not talk about it. My dad wouldn't talk about the past ever, not 5 years ago, not 5 minutes ago. He was always moving forward. He didn't want to ruin the day by talking about anything in the past. And when he was 89, he came to visit me in Portland. And my father had fathered 8 children and married 4 times. And there was a lot of trauma in my childhood that was secondary trauma from his PTSD, really, and things that, happened because he was stuck in post-traumatic stress. And so there was a lot to clear up, but I wanted to hear about the war. And we went back and forth and back and forth. And this is like the most difficult conversation I've ever had that it really changed my life when he started opening up and talking to me. And that whole time, my childhood, my young adult years, even my adult years, I was in my late 40s when he was 89. I wanted to understand my life and myself, and I looked for books, I looked for stories like mine, and I really didn't find anything that was from the family of a combat veteran. What does the family go through? There are a lot of war stories. There are a ton of war stories about World War II. I have heard that more money has been spent in Hollywood filming and retelling World War II than was spent on World War II.
Wow.
But there's not really much about what happened when the soldiers came home to raise families. And that's the story. That's what motivated me is I wanted to understand myself more. And so I wanted to tell my story. And then when my father started telling me his, I felt like I had this very precious gift that I also wanted to share with the world because his is a story of war without glory and what it's really like to be in the trenches, no matter what side you're on.
Yeah. There's so many beautiful things I'm hearing in there. Really, the search for understanding the situation, the trauma, the pain. And sounds like understanding is the path to healing and feeling better. And
Yeah, that's how it felt for me. I didn't really understand myself. I had tried to escape myself basically then because I didn't have a foundation for understanding. So I tried to get away from my childhood rather than to understand it.
so additional kudos to you for having the courage to go back to your childhood, even
Mm.
in the memoir, and retelling the stories. And I also love that you are showing another perspective of the war because sometimes it can be glorified. Um, and the victories celebrated. Unfortunately, even no matter whose side wins, there are always families suffering at the result. Both of our families were on the other sides, were suffering the consequences, no matter who won officially. So sharing that story, I think it's really important to have that really the real war. What's behind that?
Absolutely. And I think we're experiencing that today with the
Yeah.
war that is in all of our minds right now is both. There are families and people on both sides that are suffering, and there are children suffering on both sides. And I think we all feel that. And I think that is what has really struck a nerve. And, with the zeitgeist right now is trying to hold this paradox of they're both both suffer.
Both
Absolutely.
suffer. And so
Mhm.
in a way, victory actually, as a humanity, we maybe lose
Yes.
because there's so much suffering created through that
Yes.
victory or or the war.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
So almost redefining what victory means for humanity.
Yes, that would be a
On
beautiful thing to do. Yes. Start right here. And something you said about having the courage to go back and visit my childhood. The thing is, it was always with me. It never left. My childhood was always right there because I think the things that we don't look at and the things we turn away from, they don't leave us. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand some of the ways that I had become or why I had become that way, but it was right there with me. No, even though I tried to escape.
the
Yeah.
saying comes to mind, what we resist persists.
Yes. Yes.
And so even though it was covered up, it was still there and hurting you.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
For
Yet
sure.
it takes courage to uncover, to open up the wound and see what's inside.
That's true too. Definitely. Yes.
Now, any advice that you would give to someone who wants to have a difficult conversation with a loved one about their difficult experiences? Because it
Mm.
must have been difficult also to have that conversation initially with your dad, especially if he didn't want to talk about it.
Right. And with my father, some of the ways I did not realize I had become was I had become a lot like him, and he raised me in his likeness. And he was relentless and persistent. And while those can be great qualities for career and success, they are not the best qualities for interpersonal relationship. And when I started talking to him, when he asked me, "Do I have any issues?" I was persistent and relentless. I was not going to give up. I felt like he was 89 years old. This was my last chance. Now, that happened one way, and that opened our conversation because he could take it, I could take it, and it blossomed. It didn't happen overnight. It happened over a course of days and weeks and months. But I have learned since about having conversations with my children. I feel like my children, I have 3 daughters, they're all in their 20s, and I feel like they have been my best teachers. And when I wanna have a tough or difficult conversation with them, or I wanna understand them better, or I wanna say something that I don't know how to say, I think my best advice, which was your question, is start with the truth and to find out really what that truth is for you. And for me, I often start with, I don't really know how to say this or how to ask this because I've never done this before. So it might come out sideways. So please bear with me. I'm going to try my best. And then I say the truth, the deep thing that I want to understand or know.
Wow.
That's my way in usually. And that's coming from a place of vulnerability, but it's also the truth. I don't always know exactly what to do. Yes, there are strategies. Yes, there are things we can do. We can get someone's buy-in. Do you have time to talk? We can pour a cup of tea. We can create the setting that's peaceful. We can do all these things, but I feel like the thing that gets me over the hump is telling the truth. And that is vulnerable. But I feel like the truth is
Yes,
almost always vulnerable. Yeah.
absolutely. And both in personal lives and our professional lives. Just yesterday, we had another conversation with Chris about leaders admitting that they don't know something. That it takes courage to admit that we don't know
Yeah.
and to be authentic. And what I'm hearing from you in these conversations, really the first step is just being vulnerable, being courageous, being authentic, and saying the truth, how things are for us. And could be saying, I'm really nervous and uncomfortable about this conversation. Or I've never had this before, so I really don't know how to have this. But here, let's have this conversation if you're open.
Right. And telling people to be authentic, it's hard for me because sometimes when people say that, I'm like, what? I am authentic. I'm just being myself. But we do have all these layers on us. Like we can be our authentic, strident, persistent, relentless, capable self. That's an authentic part of me too. But I can also be an soft, tender, kind person. That's an authentic part of me too. Right? So when
Love that.
people tell me in all walks of life, just even in writing, just be authentic. It's so hard because we're so dynamic and our personalities are so dynamic and complex. So, well, what part of my authentic self is required for this moment is always what I'm wondering. So it's a hard thing, I think, for people to really understand. And my kids push back on that,
Oh,
authentic, I'm always authentic, you know? And it's true. I think in families, we tend to be the most authentic, but not always calling on the part of ourselves that are the most useful to us in that moment. And that is
mm,
why I try to go to the truth of the moment. And like you're saying with the CEOs, the truth of the moment is, I don't know what to do. My truth of the moment is usually, I don't really know how to say or ask this, but I'm going to try. And
mm,
that I'm going to try piece, I think is where the courage comes in because
absolutely.
especially when we don't know what we're doing, it requires courage. Because in a
Absolutely.
society, we're taught we should be smart, we should know what we're doing, we should be in control. And it's okay to not know.
I love how you're balancing these two different or multiple aspects of ourselves. And at the beginning, you've mentioned that you wanted to understand yourself, your life. And it seems like that being authentic can be sometimes even triggering because also it can have a different connotations. Or what does it mean to be authentic? Because I have so many different layers of myself or aspects of myself, but that could be completely different, yet still I am being truth to myself. And I'm also hearing with the kids sometimes if they're being authentic, but let's say they're being rude instead being really authentic. And it could
Sometimes
be
it is.
then it could be how do we define what is the truth, what is the authenticity? And I wonder, because I have the background in emotional intelligence, looking at how do we respond? Do we respond from our fears? Do we respond and talk with others out of our trauma? Or do we respond from the place of care, loving, empathy for somebody else?
Right.
And so
And
maybe that, go ahead.
yeah, the thing that really opened up for me when I was talking to my father was that he reached a point in his story, in his recounting of World War II and his experience and my father was on the battlefield for 172 consecutive days. He was a night fighter and he was a rifleman, and his unit had a 300% casualty rate.
Ouch.
So he saw a lot of death and casualty. And so he reached a point in his story that was so horrible. There were a lot of horrible, horrible things, but he reached a point that was so unimaginable to me. I really saw him for the first time without my expectations and desires for who I wanted him to be or who I needed him to be. I saw him completely separate from myself. And I think that if we are able to drop our expectations and our desires, which is really hard to do with our parents and our partners and our children and people we work for, people we need something from, it's really hard to do. But if we can do that and come from that place of letting go of that and just really trying to understand, I think for me, that is the place that I am most effective, whatever that authentic self in me is. That is where I feel like I also feel like that's where healing also happens, is when we drop what we need and really feel into the other person.
So it sounds like it's not just understanding of yourself, what happened on a deeper level through that process, but also really seeing your father in a different light too, and
Yes.
understanding also him on a different level through those conversations about his past that's connecting to your past.
Yes, and when we have, when we're going into a tough conversation, no matter who it's with, I think that we want to understand something. That's why we need to talk to the person, right? I don't think we're trying to educate them with something. If it's a conversation, it's a back and forth. And I think that bottom line is we really want to understand something to have more information to better inform us, whether it's emotional intelligence or whatever that is. And I think that if we stay curious and come from that place of deep curiosity and openness and let go of what we think and really listen from that place of curiosity, that is very useful.
I love that. And when we are curious and open, sounds like we really don't judge or blame, because we probably cannot be open when we judge. Some people might say, but my family member, yes, they had trauma in their past, but look at what they did to me. And they feel victimized, they feel angry at their parents or family member that did horrible things, even though they had their own trauma. Was it something that you felt kind of resentment, anger, upset at some point? And if so, what did you do that to make that switch to the openness, curiosity? I wonder if there was any forgiveness.
Well, it's interesting. I think I felt every emotion you can imagine toward my father except empathy. I never really empathized with him. And I think that's where a lot of us get stuck when we have experienced trauma. And I also want to say some people aren't safe to talk to. And some people have experienced such horrible trauma that their people they've been victimized by aren't safe. And so that's a whole different situation. And that I think we need to be really mindful of that as well. But for when it is safe, even if it doesn't feel necessarily very emotionally safe, because my father never really felt like an emotionally safe person because he was so unpredictable. So I will say that. But like I said, I feel like I felt every emotion toward him except empathy. And it wasn't until I was able to really see him and understand him that I was flooded with empathy. And that was the turning point for me as well, when I was able to really see him for who he was. The emotion that I felt was empathy because I saw him as a wounded soldier, a lonely man, you know, someone who had tried hard but hadn't really accomplished what he wanted in his interpersonal relationships. And I have empathy for that.
Thank you for sharing that, your truth with authenticity, because I think a lot of people can resonate with that. And I'm hearing the additional courage that even then you still didn't feel safe emotionally because you had so many times in the past where it was unpredictable, it was dangerous, you were scared.
Right. And I had guarded myself against that. And
Mhm.
that's, initially I said it wasn't overnight. It wasn't overnight that I opened up and was, warm and welcoming. And I started taking it in and I started excavating and I started making connections to, oh, my father had, men replaced in his unit three times, all of them three times. Maybe that's why he replaced his wives so often. Maybe that's why he couldn't have, emotional intimacy. Maybe that's why his attachment style was abandonment. Not that that's an attachment style, but my father abandoned his first three kids. Now their story is different than mine. Their experience with my father is different than mine. And so I really feel like it takes time. It takes time to let our to put that armor down, to start developing the ability to be vulnerable and the ability to show up and really take it in. It didn't happen immediately that I felt empathy for my father. It was over the course of months where he got to this point in his story and he was offering me something. He was becoming vulnerable with me before I would become vulnerable with him. When he said, "Do you have any issues?" He wanted to hear from me, and I turned it on him. Well, I want to hear from you first. And that's really because he wasn't a safe person to share my vulnerability with, right? So that's why I'm saying that conversation, it was tough. And I do outline it in my book to show this was a hard conversation and this is how it went back and forth. But I needed him to offer vulnerability before I could get there with him because of our past.
Mm.
So that's how it worked for me. And I think the thing about difficult conversations is that they're all so different and they all are so complex and have these different twists and turns and there's no one magic formula or we wouldn't be needing to talk about it.
Exactly. True. So when we look at what made these conversations difficult, so like there were many things that made it difficult. Can you remember one specific conversation when it was really, really difficult, if you're comfortable sharing?
Well, my father, as he started opening up, I started asking questions. Oh, is this why you married this many times? Is this that? And I wanted to understand more about my childhood. So I started asking him kind of pointed questions about, So why was it you made me get my teeth drilled without Novocaine? Or why was it that, you took my brother and sister and I to a nude beach when we were like 9, 10 years old and put us in the situations that you put us in. And my father really pushed back against that. He really pushed back against, I said, were you controlling of us? Because, and he was very controlling. And so one conversation was, Dad, were you so controlling of us because you felt like you had to be in control for survival? And is that what you learned in the war, to be in control? And his response was, I was not controlling. And anybody that knows
Mm.
my father, first characteristic, controlling,
Wow.
But he
Yeah.
said, I was not controlling. You kids had the run of the show. You had the time of your lives as kids. It was fun, you know? You had a privileged life, blah, blah, blah. And, that was tough to try to get him to see, well, it didn't feel that way to me. And so his pushback of, are you crazy? You kids you had the time of your lives. It was hard for me to say, Dad, that's not how it felt. This is how it felt from my point of view. And with my father, our dynamic was this back and forth, push back and forth, until we could get to a place where we could be open with each other. And that's how those conversations went with him. And honestly, I've been asked, did you get closure with your father on all these conversations? I will not. I will say I did not get closure on many of them. We didn't end up seeing eye to eye on many things. He still believes I had a fantastic childhood, or he did believe. He passed away 3 years ago, but he he thinks that there were parts of my childhood that were great, and he's sticking with that. And that's okay. For me, that was okay. It was the understanding that we developed. He understood that for me, it didn't feel that way. And that was the opening, and that was the important part for us, that um, we could see each other's point of view. And right now, I think in our culture, there's a lot of, I know 26% of adult children are estranged from a parent. And it's sad because our parental figures are very prominent and important in our life. And I think that the block is, we think we need to agree on everything, but we don't really need to agree on things. We just need to understand each other.
Mm. I love that because you're sharing how it still takes time, even when we have those difficult conversations. There's no magic pill as we would like to have, or magic solution that in an instant everything is going to be resolved. But it really takes a lot of conversations and a lot of strength, sounds like, too, on your side, when you shared something, when you really wanted to understand. And sounds like you got kind of an invalidating answer at the beginning.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Where it was, no, this is like what you're talking about. No, you had fantastic childhood. It was so much fun. And maybe from his perspective, because he probably was comparing it to that horrible traumatic event in his life, that was great. Unfortunately, you also had your experiences are valid also. You also had your own trauma in that way. And sounds like, in a way, as you kept sharing your truth, that he also started seeing that.
Yes, I think that's correct. I think he did start opening up to my point of view as well. And I think the point of all of it is really to deepen the relationship and have more connective conversations, because it's the tough ones that are usually the connective ones. And they are very nurturing when we can deepen conversation, whether they're hard or easy or whatever they are. I think when we can deepen into conversation and get to know each other better through that, they're very nurturing conversations. And that's why I stuck with it, because even though it was hard, it was deep and it was nurturing, and I was receiving from it.
So you identify the value in that, the nurturing of those, even when it was difficult. Sounds
Mhm.
like there was a different connection or different quality of connection that you were creating with your dad.
Right.
It sounds like also both of you were in a way transformed or changed through that process of having those conversations, that both of you are starting to open up, we're starting to open up. How would you say your relationship with other people might be changing, if you notice any changes in relationship with others, how vulnerable you were with others? Because you mentioned that at the beginning it was very hard to be vulnerable. Was it just with your dad, or was it also with other people?
Oh, it was for sure with everybody, I think.
Mm.
I never really told people where I came from or much about my past at all. And so I think I was very closed off. Came across as a very kind, warm person. And but I think that I was not vulnerable with other people as well. And I think that now I know myself so much better that I know where to stop and start and how far to let people in. And, you know, how to trust people. Trust doesn't come from vulnerability. Trust comes from predictability. I think that when we trust people not only for good things, we trust them also for bad things. Like, I know this certain friend of mine is always going to be late. So I trust her for being late. I just know that's
Yeah.
the way it is.
Interesting. Yes.
Yeah. And I have another friend who I can trust that's always early, but
Yes.
so we trust people, we can trust that this person is always going to betray us or that person is always going to do this. So it's not really, well, trust comes from predictability. I think intimacy comes from vulnerability. And so if I can trust that a person is going to respond in this way, I know how much to open up to that person. I know how much to share with them and whether they're safe to be vulnerable and intimate with or not. So I think they're wrapped together, but I think that they are separate things.
Love the
And
distinction. Hmm?
and
Continue.
your question was about have I become more vulnerable with other people? And I think I understand my appetite more for intimacy and connection, and I'm willing to take more risk. And one of the reasons is, my dad broke my heart 1,000 times. And when I heard his story, it broke 1,000 times more. And I know I can endure the heartbreak. And I understand the risk of intimacy, and I think it's worth it, because I think it is so nurturing that I would risk the heartbreak of it or the the kind of injury and wounding of whatever might come with that. Because I, at a very human level, feel like for me, the most important thing is connection and intimacy. I'm terrible at a cocktail party, to tell you the truth. I despise cocktail parties. I'm horrible at small talk, but I love talking about deeper things. And
Thank you.
sometimes it's hard to go to the deep places with people fast because they're like, "Whoa, what's happening right now?" But we can get there and we can kind of work our way into that. And that's what I kind of live for and love.
Hmm. I
And
love that.
before I
Yes.
talked to my dad, I wasn't necessarily like that. I still didn't like cocktail parties, but I wasn't really willing to take the risks that I'm willing to take now with going to the social gathering and trying to make the deeper connections, trying to make them.
I love that. It shows, I hope all the listeners that have similar experiences and they also had some trauma, difficult experiences, betrayal, heartbreak in their past, that hopefully this will show them a path that change is possible, and that opening up to the right people can bring a lot of nourishment and beautiful experiences and feeling of connection They say there's a loneliness epidemic
Mhm.
sometimes, especially in the US, the worldwide. Um, Also with the social media, kind of us presenting the not completely the truth in how we look in the morning, how we look half asleep, but especially for women, right? How we look with makeup on, at our best self. So that creates the disconnect. And I think your message is powerful on many levels, not just within our families, but also how we are even with ourselves. And that opening up with the safe people, with the people that sounds like, I also love how you shared, the trust is about the predictability. Not I trust you, I'm vulnerable, so I open up. But it needs to be almost earned, which reminds me of Brené Brown and her way that we give people little marbles and see what they do with it. And if they treat it with care, then we can trust them that we can share with them something even more precious.
Right, because we don't just give
Exactly.
them one marble, we give them a few and see what they do with them, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So we
Yes.
can predict how they are and if they are a person that treats us with kindness and care. Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. See what their patterns are.
Yes. So
Yeah.
so really, so it sounds like also who is the safe person to have that conversation with? Not everybody you've mentioned is a safe person to have the difficult conversation with. What would you say would be the first step to find out where's the boundary?
Well, I think we have to try.
Mm,
I
yeah.
think we have to try and know that we're strong and we can endure, what comes. Keep ourselves safe, of course, but I think we have to try. And I think there is a loneliness epidemic. And I think it's because we have stopped having the conversations that go deeper, that we've become very guarded and we're protecting ourselves. But what we're doing is we're creating a boundary between ourselves and deep connection. And so we have to open ourselves up in some way so that we can let people in to find out if they're safe, And it's easy to, spend time with people and understand if we can see people's patterns if we're paying attention, you know. And we know there's a feeling, there's an in the body feeling. If you learn to start feeling your body, you can start trusting your body, you know. There's that piece as well.
Mm. So
I think
sounds
the
like, yeah.
body is very intelligent and will inform you. If you start paying attention to where you hold stress or where you hold fear or where you hold excitement in your body, it will inform you as to how you feel around certain people.
So it sounds like the journey through connecting with others, be it with our family members or even anybody else, is also through reconnecting with ourselves and really tuning into the body. How does my body feel? Right, then also trauma response could be disconnecting from ourselves, even disconnecting from our bodies, from our emotions.
Absolutely. Self-awareness, I think, is really
Mm.
important. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Was there
And
any? Go
that's a
ahead, sorry.
journey in and of itself is self-awareness.
Oh yeah.
It's a lifelong journey,
It
we can't
is,
expect
yes.
that to happen overnight either. Yeah.
That's for sure. Even sometimes I relearn because sometimes I forget some realizations and I have to relearn them to go a little bit deeper in the similar area. I continuously learn also about myself. Some, as
Yes.
you mentioned, I think it is a lifelong journey for
There
sure.
is an old yogic saying that is, um, life will continue to teach you a lesson until you learn it.
I'm apparently stubborn learner sometimes.
Yes. And I often say, oh, I haven't learned this one yet. Here we go again. Yes. And
Yeah.
life will keep presenting you the same lesson until you learn it.
So we learn in the school of life in a way. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned empathy, that it was also a process to really start feeling empathy for your father. What would you say empathy for yourself? Has there been change connected to the change with empathy for your father?
Self-empathy is a really hard thing. But yes, I think the writing process and writing, I think writing is so healing. And there's been research that's proven that expressive writing is very healing. And I think I took the freeway to empathy, self-empathy through writing. Um, because I think when we write it down, and I started writing my childhood stories as a grown woman, I could have empathy for the little girl that went through all of that. And I think that if we, it's a way. I'm sure there are many ways to get to self-empathy, but it's the way that I found was sort of the express way to empathy for myself. Mhm.
That so
I
it
think
could
as
be.
women, we're trained to empathize with others and have empathy for others before the self, especially as mothers. And that if we can look at our child self, that is another way to create empathy for the self. Oh, yeah, I've been through this and I've been through that. Yeah, that must have been hard. Yeah, that was hard, you know?
That thank you for sharing that. And sounds like it's additional two ways listeners and viewers with similar experiences or that have friends or family members that been through trauma could be two ways having those conversations. And also, if they feel their own personal painful experiences in the past, could be just experimenting through writing about it.
Mm.
And of course, if there are some deep emotions, um, to contact, there's lots of professionals, therapists, coaches that can support people. Was there anybody in your environment that also supported you through that journey?
Absolutely. I've been in Jungian analysis for over a decade.
Oh,
And I've, been through therapy most of my life in and out. But yeah, I've been with the same analyst for a decade now. And that's really helped me in many ways through the whole process, in deepening and the ability to talk to my dad. Writing also was really helpful. There's deep excavation that goes on when one writes memoir. So they were all playing on each other, as well as this sort of the catalyst, which was the conversation that lasted 7 years with my father, lasted from the
excellent.
time he was 89 until the time he passed away. And we, kept going back to it, kept going back to it. And he kept bringing up things. He kept wanting to share more and more and more
Oh,
because he realized how important it was to share the story he was telling me, that it's a story that's not often told. And he thought it was really important. So he would call me and say, "Hey, did I tell you about this? Or I think I forgot
oh.
to tell you about that. Or let me tell you more about this other thing." So it was this kind of process of all these things coming together for me.
So it sounds like together you started creating a different form of legacy rather than the family trauma being given to yet another generation, creating a new legacy of healing and connection.
I hope so.
And oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so
Yeah,
much
I
for
hope so.
sharing
Yeah.
and for all your courage, your strength, your vulnerability. And it also takes courage to, I would say, I also wanted to acknowledge for the dedication to your growth, to your healing. As you mentioned, you even had support for many years, and so many people feel ashamed by getting help. And I think it's also a powerful message that it's not a sign of weakness, but actually a sign of really strength and commitment to healing. And not just for ourselves, but also for everybody that we interact with, especially with our family members. As you've mentioned, even change the communication with your daughters.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a stigma about needing help, especially in the veteran community, because they're trained to be somewhat indestructible and fierce. And there is a big stigma there. And I hope that we can somehow remove or work to remove that stigma, because we all need help. We're all humans and we're here together. Humanity it's not something that survives alone. It requires connection and creation, and we're here to support each other.
Thank you for all your contribution to the humanity and hopefully elevating us on the emotional level rather than I usually say, you know, we don't need more artificial intelligence. Maybe we need to have another revolution in the emotional intelligence.
I love that.
And being able to deal and navigate with our own emotions, being able to have empathy rather than judgment for the other, for family member or for another nation.
Right.
What could our world look like if we took that work on ourselves and did that personal work of self-awareness and then empathy?
I always say that, when people, this question about what's your book about in one word or one sentence, and, the big idea of my work is empathy. And I do want to live in a world where we feel safe enough, where we can share our deeper selves with each other, and we can feel empathy for others and for ourselves. And that is really the big idea that I get behind and that I want to encourage and support in the world, for sure.
What a beautiful message. How people, when they want to read your book, more about you, how they can reach you?
I think the best way is beckyellis.net, BECKYELLIS.net. And they can reach me. There's a connect tab. That's my website. There's a connect tab there. And on that page of my website, there is I think it's called 10 tips for deeper connecting conversations or something like that. So some of the things we talked about today are there. And I also just started a newsletter called Kitchen Table Conversations. And you can find that there. Thank you. And it's really it's interesting. I've been on book tour for 6 months, and I just recently realized what people really want to talk about is how to talk, how to have these deep conversations. And it took a lot of readers asking me the same conversation. How did you get your father to talk? My mother only wants to talk about the broken furnace. How did you get him to open up? I thought, oh, that's the thing. So I've started a newsletter where I share, the messy, complicated, sometimes funny conversations that happen.
Fantastic. So everybody,
that's where people can find me.
Oh, yay. Thank you. So lots of resources, sounds like, for anybody that wants to have those difficult conversations in this specific area with family members. There is resource for that. So thank you so much for doing your work, for contributing, for creating a new way of new legacy, and for also sharing this on our podcast. Any last word that you would want to share?
Well, I'd like to thank you for having me and for doing the work you do in the world as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I will share all the links under our podcast so everybody can access you. Also link to your newsletter. And again, thank you so much. And I will hear all of you and see you next time.
Thank you, Lucy.